welcome back to another Feisty Ferrets stream. Today we are going to be focusing on UI and programming that UI in order to achieve some of the goals that we talked about yesterday with wrapping up and getting that level flow into place for our users. So I'm starting out here on this screen where you can see we have the background image that we've used for our project. We have a quit game button, and then we have this kind of nonsensical keyboard smash button. So this is going to be our main menu scene, and I just wanted to show you a little bit of a working UI segment before we start making one from scratch for the level select screen. So since this is the main menu, I'll talk a little bit about UI in general and setting that up because that is kind of a learning curve before we jump into the code. And I'm assuming that most of the people working on this project don't have a lot of experience with code. So hopefully I'll be able to explain things in a simple way and show you guys some of the very foundational concepts. But hopefully you guys just get a little bit of a sense of coding and it's just interesting for you guys to watch and learn about. So when you're making UI, we've talked about this a little bit before, but I'll go to the scene view. So we have this canvas, right? And that can be created, everything with UI in Unity can be created by coming down to this hierarchy, and you would right click on your mouse, and then under this UI tab has pretty much everything that you need for creating a UI menu, a UI screen, anything you want. And the first thing that you're going to need is this canvas, because that's kind of where everything is centrally located. Once you start adding more elements and moving them around, the canvas is like the home base, like similar to making a painting, right? Like you have a canvas and then you layer paint and other materials on top of it. So once you have this canvas, we have ours right here, our main menu canvas, I called it. Oh, just renamed it. We're already pretty zoomed out, so I'll just try to get a little bit closer. But you can see this canvas, and then we have all these elements on top, right? Because a canvas, as we'll see when we create one from scratch, is totally blank. It's just kind of a space for you to make things in, but there's nothing set up yet. So these things that we're seeing here, we have an image, and I called it image_BG, which stands for background. And this is just our picture. It's just a PNG that we've turned into a sprite through changing the way that it's used in Unity. And then we have a couple of buttons. And buttons, when you create them, I'll just show you quickly, are automatically created with some text attached. So same as having plain text versus Text Mesh Pro text. The only difference is that Text Mesh Pro can be a little bit more stylized. It can look a little bit prettier. So you have the same options for a plain regular button or a button that uses Text Mesh Pro. And if you make one, we have this new button here now. If I zoom in on that, we can move it around, and it automatically is adding some Text Mesh Pro text underneath there. But we don't need that button. Let's just look at the ones that we already have, right? So going back to the canvas, actually, zoom in on this one specifically. So this says button level select, but that's not what it says on the actual button, right? It's just kind of a bunch of random buttons. But, oh, hi, Kitty. My cat would like to say hello. Say hi, Artemis. She's so happy to be involved. Okay, so if we press play, now all of a sudden it says select level. And that's cool. I mean, that's what we wanted to say, but how is it doing that exactly? For this quit game button over here, if we zoom in on that, if we look at the text, I've just put text input here, and that's exactly what it says. It's displaying exactly what I've typed into this Text Mesh Pro text input field here. And the same thing is happening for this button mash over here, right? It's the same thing, just for this button level select one instead. I've just typed this in, and that's what's appearing. So why is it turning into what we actually want it to be called once we're pressing play on the scene? So the reason it's doing that is because of a script. And scripts are how code is handled in Unity. You write a script, you use functions from it, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and that's how all the magic happens, how all the interactivity happens, how animations happen, everything that seems alive about a game and not just static, even things like pressing the button and having something triggered by that event, it's all handled by scripts. So our script right now is located on the canvas itself because the canvas is controlling all of our UI. So if we have one script centralized that handles all of our UI events, we might as well just have it live on the canvas. And we can see it down here. As you already know, these are all components, and we have a bunch of components that are built in whenever we add a raw, plain thing from Unity just by adding one of these. They'll all have a bunch of components attached, and Artemis is being very affectionate right now. Sorry, have to pet her. But the script is not automatically included. These scripts are things that we write and we add ourselves by dragging it on or by adding the component like so. So if I wanted to just add a script, you can see some other scripts named here. So if you want to add a script, you can either drag it on or just press add component like any other component. And Kitty, I'm trying to work. And so let's jump into this script that is attached to our canvas. It's called main menu buttons. So all you have to do, let me do that slower again. So we're under assets and scripts right now. And there's a bunch of different kinds of scripts that we, again, have talked about a little bit before. But these are specifically going to be our UI scripts. And to open Visual Studio, which you'll have to install separately if you want to code, or I think it might come with Unity if you check off a certain box. But if you don't have it, Unity automatically uses Visual Studio. And if you have that installed, all you have to do is double click on your script and it'll pull up automatically. So scripts are pretty mysterious if you have no idea what code is or if you've never programmed at all. So let's break it down a little bit. We have this is our script, right? Like this is the area that we can type in. I can type what is called, what I'm doing right now is called a comment, and I can just say, hello, Feisty Ferrets. That's you guys. You guys are the Feisty Ferrets. So you just type in this space, and as long as everything compiles, meaning that everything can load correctly and works and nothing is broken, at least not in the sense that compiling means that nothing is broken in the sense that you can run this script even if it doesn't work correctly. Like it may be broken in the way that it's not doing what you want it to, but at the very least the syntax, aka the things that you've typed in this space, make sense to the computer and they understand what you're trying to do, even if it doesn't work exactly as intended. So I had just typed a comment there, and that's anything with these two lines in front of it, and it'll turn green. The whole line will turn green after this two lines. So you just type 2 forward slashes, and then you can type whatever you want. And this will not infect compilation. It can be totally nonsensical. It doesn't mean anything. The computer basically skips over any lines that are in comments like this. So you can type whatever you want here, and often people will use that to leave notes, or sometimes when they're testing certain approaches, they might comment out one thing and uncomment another, which we will talk about in one of these functions. So I've said functions a couple times, right? So that's one of the very core concepts of coding is a function. And so start is a function. We have this one right here. And load, level, select, and quit game are also functions. Even though they're all functions, they all have different purposes. A function is basically something that either is automatically called by Unity or that you can manually call, meaning write the name of, and something will happen in the game. Like I said, that could be an animation, that could be just calling another function, it could be triggering some event. It could be, for example, when you start this level, this is one of the built-in ones, we don't have to manually call this. This is automatically called by Unity whenever an object with this script attached, meaning it's a component of some object in our scene and is active, then it'll automatically call the start function and one time at the beginning of the loaded level, and everything that's inside of the function happens. So this is called, we don't have to worry about that. It's handled automatically. And then these things occur. And these things just means whatever is inside of here, from the opening bracket to the ending bracket. So I'll give you a second to kind of think about that. Literally anything that I typed in here is part of this start function. And everything after this closing bracket is something else in the script that we don't care about until we've called something else. It doesn't matter right now, though. So the way that we're jumping back to our actual scene here, we have this text that's set up inside of the scene. And that makes sense. We just type it in right there. But it's changing automatically because of our script. And the way that that's happening, I just wanted to show you again to remind you, kind of center you on where we're going with this. The way that that's happening is we have this, it's called a variable called level select text. And this is a TMP underscore text object. So if you're looking at a variable, we have these qualifiers in front sometimes. They don't have to exist. I could delete this and it wouldn't matter. But I specifically want it to be private. And the two that you should be familiar with when it comes to variables are public and private. So public here for a variable, and a variable is just some object that has some value. And that might not make sense right now, and that's okay. We can talk about it later another time. I don't want to get too into the details since we're trying to get some stuff done today. But I do want to, explain some things that will hopefully make things make a little bit of sense if you're reading this and trying to actually follow along with what everything means. So yeah, a variable is just some object. We know that everything in Unity is a game object. So it's a similar concept. An object is just some kind of thing in this world that has some kind of value. Like a game object could be our Feisty Ferret itself. It could be our camera. It could be the actual canvas is a game object. So it's anything, and then we can specify what exactly that game object is. Like if we had a canvas game object, we can either say game object to be general, so that's the same as a variable, or we could say it's a canvas, which is being specific about the type of game object. So having the TMP text here is the type of variable that we're dealing with. And then we give it a name, right? So the name can be anything that you want as long as it's not already taken somewhere else in the script or built into the Unity language. So if I were to say TMP text and give it the name private, that wouldn't work because private is already built into something. It already has a meaning inside of Unity. So as long as you're not crossing any of those boundaries, you can name it whatever you want. And again, private here just means that it's for the sake of this talk, it's just meaning that you can only see it inside of this script. Everything outside of the script has no idea that this level select text variable exists. But if I were to change it to public, that means that things outside of the script can see it. So from the scene, I could access this level select text and change it to something else. And actually, I'll show you that right now. So I've changed it to public. It was private before. And now if I click on my main menu canvas and I come down to where our script was as a component, now suddenly I have this level select text. That's the name of our variable, right? And then we have this TMP text showing as the type of variable. And this none means that we need to assign something to it, or we can at least assign something to it. And right now there's nothing assigned. But again, if I change it back to private, and then we go back into this, we let it compile, which again just means that it's making sure that everything is readable to the computer and that the computer understands all of the script and the syntax. So now that we've changed it back to private, we can't see it anymore. We can't access it from the scene. So I want this to be private because I don't want anyone to mess with it. I want it to just be handled inside of the script. I don't want anybody to be typing in other random things if there were like level designers working on this. So once we have this variable set up, it's called a declaration. We've basically just let the script know that, hey, we're going to have a variable called this of this type, and we don't want it to be seen outside of the script. And the computer is like, okay, I've tucked away a bit of space for that. I know that that's going to be used probably at some point. So it's just making it aware of it, is declaring the variable. And then once we have start going, which again is built into Unity, we don't have to call it. It's just a function that gets called one time at the very beginning of the level being loaded. So once start is called, automatically handled, then we can assign our variable a value. When I just showed you in the scene and it was public, it had none attached to it, and that is because when you create a variable, when you declare it, you can just declare it based on saying this is the name of it, this is the type, etc. But you can also give it a value up here. So I can't right now because it's an object, but say if I made an int type, which is just a number without a decimal place. And I could also say equals and then give it a value right here. But I don't have to. I can do that later, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm setting this equal to something now. I'm giving it a value. And this is a little bit complex for now, but basically what I'll tell you about this line of code is that you can look for things that exist in the scene from a script, because if you make it public, if I were to have made this public, then I could have dragged something or found something in the scene, similar to dragging a component onto a game object. You can drag game objects onto script variable placements in order to let the script know this is the exact one that we're talking about. But in order to do that, you have to know which game object you're looking for ahead of time. So there's other ways that you can do that, which include using this get component function command. And you can just get the component from where you are right now, or again, this is a little bit complex, but you can also get the component in children, which is what I'm doing, which basically, instead of looking at the surface level, I'll show you really quick, trying not to be too complicated, but so if this is our game object and we were to say get component in object, that's looking through all of these that are just on the very surface level of this game object. So any of these components that we're scrolling past in the inspector, I could access any of those as long as they exist. I could use the get component function to find it. But say that I know that it's a button and it's going to have text attached to it automatically, and I don't want to have to specify that I'm looking for this text because maybe it has multiple pieces of text. So I could look for a component in children, and then instead of having to specify, okay, I want the button, and then I want the text of the button, and drag all of those things over, or just go through a multi-step process, I can just skip right to the point and say get component in the children of this. And I think that we've talked about this before with empty game objects and putting things under it and how that makes them children and they all kind of move around together. It also just means that they're attached generally and they have kind of a communication between them. So if this is our parent object, the button level select, then this text is a child, and anything else that was underneath it and kind of set aside, like you see here, anything that could be hidden by this arrow would also be a child. And you can get component in children just as easily as you can get the component at the base level. So you can also just look for things without having to have this parent-child relationship using the find function. So to make a long story short, basically what I'm doing here is I'm looking through all of the game objects in the scene to find the specific button that's called button underscore level select. So this one. And the reason that we specify it by name is because I don't want this button to be selected for any reason, right? I want it to always be this one. And then once I have the TMP text component that is stored under the text part of this button, then I just set that text right here. And that's just setting a variable that exists on the text to select level. And that is how, long story short, how the select level is put on there once we actually start the game. Because again, it's not going to do anything until we've actually loaded this scene and we're actually interacting. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of functions. I'll talk a little bit about the other functions too, but we've covered very briefly and loosely variables and functions at this point. Hopefully you have a little bit of an idea of what's going on in the script. So these other two functions are a little bit different, right? So I've said it before, this is a private function because we don't need to call it from anywhere else. Unity handles that for us. There's another one that's built in that's very common and is actually created automatically when you make a new script called update. It's also private and handled automatically by Unity. But instead of being called one time when the scene is loaded at the very beginning, it's going to be called every frame. And you don't have to know how often a frame is called at this point. You can just know it's called very often and in a repeated sequence. So whatever is inside of this update, instead of happening one time like it happens here, it'll happen over and over and over and over again until the game is quit or something tells it to stop, basically. But those are private functions that are handled by Unity. What about functions that we write? So these two are examples of that, and that's how we're having our buttons have events that happen when we press them, is we're on the press of the button, we are calling these functions. And for that reason, they're public, right? It's because, not because we want to change the function from the script, but because we want to have access to the function from the scene. And that's the difference here. I mean, if you have a public variable, then yes, you're able to change the value of that variable from the scene. But more importantly, it's having that access and not having it restricted to only this script can see what's going on in this variable function, what have you. So with these two, let me show you how they're working. We have two buttons here, right? And if we want something to happen when we press the button, let's zoom into this one a bit. I don't know why it keeps putting me underneath. I would like to be head on, please. Oh. Now where am I? Oh my gosh. Okay. It is taking me all over the place for some reason. Camera, why? I'm upside down. Okay. Here we go. Now we can see what we're talking about. Okay, so with this button, if we want something to happen, here we go. Now I have control over my mouse. Then we want this on click to occur. And we have this random button that I made at some point that we aren't actually using, but you can see, just as a good example, this the on click of this button, the list is empty. There's nothing that's going to happen if I were to click this button. If I were to click it, I could still click it, but nothing would happen because there is nothing set up here to happen. I'm just going to delete that one. But for our level select button, we've added a new event, basically, to this. So we're adding something to the list of things that happens on click if we press this. And if I only want the one thing to happen, then I can just press minus, and I can add and subtract as many events as I want to from this on click list. But what's already put in place here is something from our main menu script that we've been looking at. And the way that I was able to do that, you saw that if I pressed plus here, there isn't anything. It's just kind of none. I might be able to press one of these random objects, but who knows where that might lead me. And again, similar to components dragging onto things, similar to scripts dragging onto things, if I know that my canvas is the one who has this script that I would like to call a function from, then into here I can just drag my canvas, and then I have access to all of the scripts that my canvas has, which includes main menu buttons. And I can go down here and choose one of these to attach as a call. So we have already, I'll just show you in the existing one. If I was to go down into my script called main menu buttons, I could also do any of these, but I wouldn't mess with that because it's a little bit convoluted. So for now, just mess with what you know. We've written our own functions here that are public, load, level, select, and quit game. And we want this one to be calling this function. So that's set up. Now it's going to call that function as soon as we press the button once we're playing the game. And calling the function, again, just means letting the script know that everything inside the function, from the beginning brace to the end brace here, is what we want to happen. So this says scene manager.load scene 1. So based on the name of this function, we can assume that we're going to be going to another scene. We're going to load it, which presumably means that we're going to be exiting the scene and going into a different scene. But what is this 1 here? Why is it 1? What number could it be, etc. So I have this commented out here. We talked about what a comment is. our script is not reading this line, but it's just kind of a note for someone else to know about, or testing different versions of the same code. And this is the second thing that I said. It's the same load scene, but instead of using this mysterious number 1, I'm using a specific level name. And you might think, well, why wouldn't I always do that? So let me show you a little bit. Again, these 2 lines of code are going to do the exact same thing, so we only need one of them. So again, what is this one? Why wouldn't I just use the name? Let me show you. So if I go into my project scene again, and I press File, Build Settings, then this, you don't really have to worry about the build settings except for the scenes in build. This is the one place where, for now, you might be interested in using the build settings. So we have this list called scenes in build, and I can check them on and off, and they'll have numbers, and the numbers will go away. But you see these numbers appearing and disappearing as I'm checking them on and off. And that's basically saying, instead of referring to this level by name, you can just use this number that is automatically assigned when you add a scene to the build. And if you're making your own scene, again, this is where it might come into being important for you guys working on this project. If you're making your own scene, then you can just open the scene at any point, go into the build settings, and click Add Open Scenes, and your scene will be automatically included into the game. And that is just really helpful for the entire game to know, okay, this is my list of levels. This is everything that I can access, all of the things that the player might want to be playing. So if I'm saying load level 1, again, this number is basically, now that I've included it to the list of scenes in the build, it's just an alias. Like, instead of having this really, really long name that I'm going to have to look up every time I want to use it because it's not very short, then I can literally just say 1, and that's so much simpler, right? So if you've added them to the scenes and you know kind of which level is associated with which number, it's just kind of a more easy way to think about it. And that's going to be our load scene. So it's going to load this level, the level select, and that makes sense because we want to select a level once we open our main menu and we want to play the game. We want to select a menu or select a level. So that's the scene that we'll be going to from the main menu. But we also have this quit game because we have another button, the quit game button. Again, we like to name things in ways that make sense to anyone looking at the project, right? Like, if I were to have named this button, like the button smash over here, like, I have no idea what that button's going to do. So just good practices with code, good practices with level design, anything with games, name things in a way that it makes sense. It may seem a little bit repetitive because we're like, okay, the button is called button quit game, and also the text says quit game, and also the function says quit game, but that's a way to know that all of those things are connected, right? And also, you're very clear on what exactly this should be doing. There's no like, well, maybe it's supposed to do this other thing instead. Like, no, it's definitely supposed to quit the game. And all we have here is this little line of code that, again, is just built into Unity. It's not a function that I've written. So these 2 functions are ones that I've written, just meaning that I've created the name. I'm deciding what happens inside of the function, but the built-in ones that we call from other places, like this application.quit, Unity just kind of knows, okay, that means that our application, aka our game, should end now. So that's kind of an overview of some of the built-in functions that we're using, and how you can attach functions to buttons as you're creating your own UI menus. Hopefully that gives a little bit of a good enough overview for us to start getting into our own scene and creating something from scratch now. And if you guys have any questions after this stream, I know I'm covering so much content and trying to give a lot of information about code and UI in general in a short amount of time. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask in the Discord. I will not mind answering whatsoever. But for now, if we press this play button, if we press on quit game, it's not going to do anything right now. That's just because we don't actually have an application yet. We're just in the editor. If we were to actually build this game and have it be an executable, the quit game would work. But because we're just in the editor, there's nothing for it to quit, so it's not doing anything. But if we press on this select level, then we've loaded into this scene, and we know it's doing the right thing even though we can't see anything because we know the name of the level. We saw that commented out, and it is in fact Feisty Ferrets level select. So we know that it's doing the right thing. We just don't have anything here yet. So let's fix that. I go into the UI levels and the level, level select. So this is an entirely blank slate. There's nothing here in this scene. I'm gonna take a sip of water quick. And we're going to kind of build up our UI here. So it's good when you're creating your own scene, and especially when you're going to start scripting, to have a plan instead of just kind of going along with whatever feels good. You can do that, but it also just makes sense to have a game plan, like, okay, this is what I would like the level to look like, or this is what I want the script to do. So my plan for this level is to have one button, and to be clear, we can beautify this later. Right now, and at any stage of getting things done, getting things fast, and just making it work at the very bare level, you're not worried about making it pretty. It's the same thing with prototyping a level. You don't care if it looks gorgeous. You just want it to work. And that's at a technological level, right? Like, we just want it to do the right thing. We can make it look nice later. So my goal right now is to not make it look pretty. It's to have a few buttons. One of them will be in the center of the screen, and it's just going to display the name of the level that we'd like to load. And we have multiple levels, right? So how exactly are we going to handle being able to pick different levels if there's only one button in the center? So what I'd like to do is have two buttons, one on either side of that central button, one of which moves to the left and one of which moves to the right throughout all of the levels, kind of like a little catalog book. So it would be like flipping a page and looking through all the different levels in order to select one. So those are 3 buttons already. And then the final button that I'd like to have on this screen for now, and we might decide to do something else later. If somebody else was the game designer for this game, maybe we would make this as the very prototype, and they would decide that, okay, well, this isn't how we want it to look. We want it to do this other thing. But for now, the 4th and final button that I would like to have on the screen is a random button. And that'll just choose any of the levels at random and load that, and the player won't get to choose in that case. They'll just say, it's up to you, computer. Let me know what you want me to play. So that's my plan. And I'm going to start, as you do with all UI processes, by making a canvas. Again, in the hierarchy, right-click, scroll down to this UI tab and canvas. So now I have this blank slate. Again, there isn't a background image like we had for the other one. It's completely blank. Adding an image is a different UI element that you'd have to do manually. And once I have this canvas, I'm not going to worry about putting an image in there. I'm just going to start adding some buttons. So I keep doing something with the mouse that makes it move in annoying ways. But because we want this all to be a child of this canvas, I'm going to just make a button here. And I believe if you were to try to make a button by itself, or any of these by itself without adding a canvas as the parent, I think it would just make a new canvas for you. Oh, or it just adds it to the existing one. Let me test that. I'm just curious. So what's a test? Yeah, so even though I'm not selecting this canvas, let me see if it... Yep, so it makes a canvas for you. So you have to have a canvas in order to do anything. And if you forget that step, that's okay, because it'll make it for you. Actually, that's exactly what I want. So I'm going to rename this so that we don't get confused. Level, select, canvas. And then this button is going to be, what should I name this? It is important to think about names for these things, like I was explaining a bit earlier. I could just leave it as button. I could name it anything, but I want it to be really clear what exactly this button is going to be doing. So I guess I will call this displayed level. Displayed level button underscore displayed level. Yeah, that way we know it's a button, and we know that it's going to be displaying the level that is being flipped through in the catalog. And I might change the name later, but I'm also going to just make 2 more for now. Just actually Control C, Control V to copy paste. And oh my gosh, my mouse is being laggy for some reason. So I will say this one is going to be called button. I'll say previous, and this one will be button next. Something you might notice if you are setting up UI is that things display on top of each other. There is no side by side in this. The original displayed level button here, it's been selected, but it's underneath of one of the ones that's been placed on top of it. And I can change that by simply dragging these around. And you can see them kind of move their positions relative to each other, relative to being on top or underneath one another, like that. So if you have some issue with stacking and layering, then that's probably the case, and you just need to decide which order you want things in. But for us, it won't really matter right now because, if it's next, it should be on this side, and previous should be on this side. And I'm not really even worried about like spacing. The aesthetics inside of me is telling me space everything out nicely, and my mouse is being so laggy right now. Here we go. Please. Okay, I might just swap to using my trackpad. Sorry. So I'm not going to worry about placing it nice and evenly. I just want it to be in the correct general area of where I want it. And I'm going to leave this as having the plain old button text because we're going to be changing it later based on the name of it. But I do at least want this to be bigger. These two can stay the same size. Let's see, in the text here, I will change it to say previous. And this one will say next, and they can stay the same size. And this one I will make bigger, and I can do that just by going here, scaling it. It's going to look ugly, forgive me, but we don't care if it looks ugly right now. It's okay to look ugly right now. I'll move this one over just a little bit because I can't help it. I do care about aesthetics. I might make it a little bit bigger because the names for these levels, as you saw, can get pretty long. So now that I have these 3 buttons in place, I will wait to do the random button until later. But we need some way to actually interact with these, right? Like if I were to press play right now, I'll be able to see all of these buttons. And I can even see that I'm hovering over it and that something is happening when I'm pressing down on it. That's when it gets tinted this other color, which you can set up all the colors for, but we won't go into that right now. But yeah, you can see that something is happening and it knows that it's being pressed, basically. It knows that it's being hovered over and pressed, but there's no function set up on the on-click list, so nothing is actually occurring. So let's fix that. So we're going to make a new script. And we'll attach it to the canvas once we're done with it, or once we've gotten the ball rolling on it. So to make a new script, we're going to put this under Assets, Scripts, UI Scripts, because it is a UI script. And we're going to go down into here, right-click on your mouse or your trackpad if you're me right now, go up to Create and press C# Script. And I will call this Level Select Buttons. Once it's named, it will automatically pull up. Actually, it doesn't. You can double click here and it will slowly load up the correct script in Visual Studio. So here we have a automatically generated script. So like we were talking about earlier, the two functions that Unity uses the most that are built in and don't have to be called by you are start and update. So we talked about those earlier. We know what they are. They even have these helpful little comments, which again, the computer doesn't read, to tell you what they do. And I think that we will not need update because if you think about a menu, you don't necessarily need it to do things every frame. You don't necessarily, you might want animations, you might want something moving along the UI, but we don't have anything that fancy yet because we're not worried about it being pretty. So we might add this back later, but for now we just want start. You also might notice that there is no private qualifier in front of this. That's okay. It automatically knows that start is private, and I believe any function that you write without specifying whether it's public will automatically assume itself to be private. But I will add it there just so that we have familiarity with reading it and knowing that private means that the scene doesn't have access to calling it. So where should we start, right? So our goal was to have a level name be displayed in the center button, and if we press it, it'll automatically load that level, and also to be able to flip back and forth between them. So I think a good place to start would be, what is our first level going to be? We talked about having the names of the levels. We name them when we create them, like any scene. But that's a little bit cumbersome to have to write down a list of them or pull them from some other source and maintain those names. And what if the name changes? It just gets a little bit convoluted. So we're going to be using the numbers based on the scenes being inside of the build settings, like we showed earlier. And we know that our scene previous to this, so let's look at that quick. Our scene previous to this that we loaded was 1, and that loads our level select scene. So going back to build settings, we are actually able to drag these around if we don't like the way that they're numbered. So if I wanted the level example to be 0, I could move it up in this just by clicking and dragging it. And in my other script would now be wrong. If I were to press that button again, it would actually load the main menu because main menu now has the number 1. So I'll put that back. Actually, I'll put this one back. There we go. So now level select is, again, it has a build index of 1. It's not the first scene because in code, we always start counting from 0, not from 1. So our first scene is actually 0. So our second scene is 1. And that means that for now, everything after the level select scene, any number after the level select scene that is valid and not too high, is a level that we can play. So if we want to start with the first level in this list, then we know that that number is going to be 2, which is the third scene in our build settings. So let's add some variables. So I'm going to make them private because I don't want anybody to mess with these. They're going to be ints, which is short for integer. And I mentioned it briefly earlier, but it's just a number that doesn't have a decimal place. So I'm not going to set what it's equal to right now because our script can handle that, but I will give it a name and say, I'll call this one display level because that goes with the name that we created earlier for our button. And I also want to have, this is just me thinking ahead, I also want to have a first playable level, I'll call it, index. Actually, I'll add index to here too. And then we also want private int last playable level index because we don't care about the non-playable levels. And we also want to be clear that we're not storing the scenes, we're storing the indexes, which is just, in this case, you can think of it as another word for number. So, just knowing that we're going to be wanting to pull from the build settings and be loading these scenes, there are these things, these magical things called libraries, and they are anything that says using. So anything after the word using is a library, which basically just means it gives you access to more things. And I'll actually show you something in code that is, it's not encouraged for new people, but I'm going to encourage it anyways, because if you're watching this, you probably want to be a pro someday. Copy paste is your best friend. Looking back at old scripts that do the same things or similar things, you don't have to research and memorize everything. That's a lot of functions to know. You can just look at your old scripts and copy paste things. So we know that we want to do a scene manager and load scene, and we're not going to load one every time like in this script, but we can still copy paste that. And actually I will make a new function to store that in, because I'm just proving or showing you how to access some things and like why libraries are important right now. So I'm going to call this load displayed level. And actually, I'm not being very clear in my naming right now because I'm naming things level, but Unity calls them scenes. So those are identical right now. A scene is a level, but I should be probably saying load displayed scene. Since I've already named all these level, I'm just going to keep going with that, but you get my point. Naming is important. So I'll actually put this line here since that's actually where we want to load a scene. But my point is, in this, you see some red squiggles appear. And if I were to try to use this, these red squiggles are one indicator that your computer gives you ahead of time, or Visual Studio gives you ahead of time, to say, hey, I don't think the computer can read this. I don't think that this will compile in your scene if you were to try to play the game. And that's because here we have this library inclusion. So using Unity Engine.scene management, that's adding this library called scene management. And once we paste that in here, the red squiggles go away. And that basically means everything in the library that it has to offer, we can read it. I mean, that's why it's called a library, because you're able to read all these new things that otherwise you wouldn't be able to have knowledge about. So now our scene manager is legal, and we don't want this to be one all the time. We might not have anything actually assigned to it yet, but we know just from where we're going with this that we want it to be the displayed level index that is loaded. And this will be our function that we use for our middle button, our main button. But the reason that Scene Manager is important and useful for us in setting up this basic stuff as well is because, well, for the first playable level index, actually, we would just kind of have to know that 1 is the select level build index, and we would have to know that we want to do anything after that. So we can just set it up right here to say that we know it's going to start at 2. So first playable level index will be 2. And this isn't the best way to handle it. Using raw numbers indicates that at some point you might have to manually come back and change them, which to the key point means that you have to remember that you have to change it, which is not always the best thing for a programmer, because when you've written a lot of code, you might not remember that this was a 2, and you would have to come back and change that at a later date if anything were to change. But for now, it's okay. We're just getting this functional first, right? But we don't know how many levels we're going to have total in our build settings. We know that we're starting with 2 because it's after 1, and 1 is where our level select is in terms of build index numbers. But we don't know how many exactly levels we have, and we definitely don't want to have to update this script every time we add a new level. So that's where having the scene manager comes in. We can actually, since we can do all of the loading and access all of the build index numbers from the scene manager, there's this really cool thing that you can do in Visual Studio when you're programming in Unity. If there's anything that's yellow like this, or even a function, you can right-click on the name and say go to definition. And that'll pull up all of this info, and it basically shows you all of the built-in functions that you have access to calling and all of the variables. And as long as it's public, right, not private, as long as it's public, we can access those and pull them into another script and use them for our own stuff. And if you're using good naming conventions, which I know I'm harping on, but if you're using good naming conventions, which the professionals at Unity ought to be, then you should just be able to read this list of functions and say, okay, if I want to get a scene by a build index, that's exactly what I'm looking for, right? So I could call this function and assume that I know what it's doing. I don't have to guess about what it's doing. And for us right now, the reason that this is helpful, looking at this is helpful, is because we want to know how many scenes are in this list in our build settings. And this is where that's stored. scene count and build settings. Again, there's no way that a programmer is going to remember all of these variable names and functions names off the top of their head. So being able to quickly look for things like this, whether it's in the actual Visual Studio and pressing on things to explore a bit, or also, also if you go online to the documentation, which is a programmer's best friend, you can just find all of this helpful information and be able to quickly research. Like, there's nothing wrong with not enough and documentation, and also the built-in Visual Studio search options are your friends in this case. So once we have this scene count and build settings, now we can make our last playable label index equal to that. And scene manager, because it's stored in the scene manager, we have to tell it to get this from there. We don't have a variable called this, so we have to let it know that this with this dot, it's stored inside of the scene manager, and that's where we're getting the variable from because we don't own it. But let's keep in mind, we count from 0 in programming in general, and just in game design, everything counts from 0. And our level select was our second level, but it had the build index of 1. So if we want to get the scene count and build settings, presumably it's going to tell us how many scenes there are in the build settings. And right now, let's see, I think we had 5, right? Oh, it has to compile the script. Sometimes this is one of the annoying things about being a programmer. You have to wait for things to compile. Luckily, this is fast, but sometimes it gets really long. So yeah, in our build settings, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels, but the number of the build index only goes up to 4. So this will return me a 5. And if I try to load a level 5, that doesn't exist in terms of build indexes. So what I have to do is say a -1 here. And now I have my very first playable level index and my last one. So now I should be able to flip through. And you'll notice here in these variables that we've set up, some of them are a different color, right? Like this isn't, it's like grayed out. It's not as bright as this displayed level index. And what that's telling you, and it does the same thing for functions, what it's telling you is that this isn't used anywhere. So if you have a variable and it's not being used, A, you can just delete it and free up some memory, or B, there's a bug somewhere and you're not doing the things that you actually want to do. So displayed level index is brightened and is being used in this function here, but these two aren't actually being used yet. So we'll do that later, right? But what it doesn't warn us about, and what it doesn't care about at this point, is these two, even though they're not being used anywhere, first playable level index and last playable level index, even though they're not being used anywhere, they have values, right? We've assigned them values here after declaring them. But our displayed level index has only been declared. It has not actually been assigned a value. So that's a bug in the script. Like if we were to do this right here, there is no value assigned to this, and that would break the code, right? So we have to be diligent about that ourselves and realize that probably the first displayed level index that we'll want to have is our first playable level index. And now we can, this has brightened up as soon as I did that because now it's being used for something. And we just have to keep in mind, like, okay, make sure that you're initializing all of the variables that you declare, where initializing just means giving it an initial value. So once we have that all set up, we have these, and let's just test and see if our load level displayed works. We don't really care about the flip-flopping yet. Let's just see if this works. And also, let's see. I think what I would also like to do is, well, we'll see if it works first, and then we'll put the name in of the text, because we know which one is supposed to be loading. So if the first displayed level index is this level example, that's the one that we've been working on a lot in these streams. So if I press play, oh, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I haven't actually assigned the script to anything. This is another thing in programming that trips people up. I've been coding all this stuff, but I haven't actually attached it to anything inside the Unity scene, and I haven't set up my buttons. So it's really easy to get ahead of yourself and write up a function, but never actually call it. Super common issue in programming. Just getting too excited and forgetting to actually call the things. So I'm dragging this script. I just drag it. I left clicked on my mouse and dragged upwards to this canvas, and now it's automatically attached itself. And now for my displayed level button, I'm going to scroll down and press add on this little plus here on our on click list. I can drag my canvas down to here, and now I have access to all of the script functions that it has. And because I made the load displayed level function public, I can call that here. And now if I save, always save, and press play, it's actually attached. And I should load my level. Yay! Okay, cool. So that works. Now we're going to start flip-flopping between them. And before that even, we're going to make sure that the names display, because if I left it as button, I could be going next in previous and then pressing the button to check if it works, but that's really slow. It's not very good for quickly bug catching. If I just display the level name, even if it's a really long and cumbersome level name, at least I can physically see that the names are switching over, right? So I'm going to make two new functions. Display next level and display previous level. And we are probably going to go a little bit over time on this, but if we don't get to everything in this stream, then I can always continue streaming next week on making this all work out. But I'll try to wrap it up pretty quickly to at least get us to the point where we can flip through them and hopefully do the random, and that should be good for today's stream, but it will go a little bit over, I believe. So for display next level, we have our first playable level, and these are just numbers, right? So I can just say, actually, displayed level index plus plus. And this is kind of a hack. Plus plus means the same thing as saying plus equals 1, which also means the same thing as equals displayed level index plus 1. All three of those are the same way of writing, just add 1 to this variable. And that will do that. And I can also do the same thing in the opposite direction for previous level with minus minus, subtract 1 from displayed level index. And that would work fine for just swapping the numbers. However, what happens if I'm already at 2, and that because that's our first assigned level index, and then I go down 1 by pressing previous? What level am I going to load? I'm going to load our level select. We don't want to load our level select when we're selecting a level. And also, worse than that, what happens if I'm at the maximum number? So we have 5 minus 1. The max build index right now is 4. What happens if I press display next level and now I'm trying to load level 5, which doesn't exist? Our game crashes probably. It's broken. We've done something wrong. So the way that we can catch this is by using a little bit of logic, and I think this is the last new concept of code that I'm going to introduce today. But we call it, it's basically just logic, and we call it an if statement. So we're going to check if a condition, a fact basically, is true in this script, then do something else. If it's not true, we don't have to worry about it, and we can just skip over it. And I'll show you what I mean. So if displayed level index. So here's our if statement. If anything inside of these parentheses, opening and closed, if this statement that I'm about to write is true, and the statement is displayed level index, and also is greater than the last playable level index, then we've gone over our amount that we're allowed to load, and we need to set it back. So if that is true, then I will set displayed level index to the first playable index. And so we'll just loop around and it will be handled, nothing will break, it'll be all good. But if this is not correct, so if we're at 2 still, then it's definitely not greater than 4. And this code doesn't execute, so it doesn't do anything. It just skips over it and doesn't read what's inside of this. So that's, a really quick explanation of how an if statement works, but hopefully it makes sense. We'll do the same thing here, but in the opposite direction. If displayed level index is less than our first playable level index, then we'll set our displayed level index to our last playable level index. And before we test this, I'm going to set up the names. And again, copy paste is your friend. We know that it's going to be the TMP text of this button. And actually, first of all, this is a different library. So the same way that the scene management was squiggled out and we couldn't use it, I'm not going to be able to access the TextMesh Pro information if I don't add this TM Pro library. And then we know that we want to edit the text of another TMP text variable. So I can just copy that, Control C, Control P. And we can just call this displayed level name. And now this gives us a good differentiation of why we don't want it to just be displayed level. Displayed level what? Is it the actual scene? Is it the build index? Is it the name of it? So now we have a good reason to have more specificity in these names, right? We want to know the index and the name of this level separately. So for our TMP text, let's see, was that whole convoluted mess here. I'm going to write a private function here too. Let's say set displayed full name. So this is a private function, which means I'm going to have to call it inside of the script because only the script can see it if I want to use it. We also want to just set up, initialize this displayed level name. And let's see, we know that this button is called button underscore displayed level. So I can just come copy that and put that into our find here. And then get component and children TMP text will just work because our displayed level text has a TMP text child. And then I will say, instead of this line of code, since we're going to be doing this multiple times, it doesn't make sense for us to rewrite the same code over and over again. So here, I'll copy that and put it in here and then change what this will be in a second. But more importantly, I'll say, I'll call the function. So I'm calling this function. And before I did this, like I said before, you can tell when something isn't being used. Because, okay, well, it was grayed out before, but now it's not playing nice. But once I've actually called it, then the Visual Studio will automatically make it brighter to say, okay, now you're actually using it, which indicates that we're doing something with it at least. If we were doing nothing with it, then we'd be concerned, right? So we use our displayed level name, not index. Names are important. And then we're going to, I think what we should do is do scene manager dot get scene by build index, and then use that displayed level index there, and then name. And that should, after we call this function, set our text for that button to be the name of it. It won't be a pretty name because they're very long. That's okay. We don't really care right now. And we need to call this function multiple times, but at least we don't have to write this huge long thing. It's doing the same thing in all of these spots, but we at least, it's a shorter way of letting us know. And if we had multiple lines of code in there, it would save us a lot of time and retyping, etc., just to be calling this function instead of rewriting the whole line of text. So let's see if that works as I expect. Something in code, not everything always works as you expect, and that's okay. It's a part of the process to make mistakes, not a big deal at all. But hopefully it does work. Okay, so I can't tell if it's working. Well, actually, there's one good way to test if it's working, at least in terms of switching the levels. Let's see. So if we had the example level, and I press next and I press this, then it should load a different level. And it loaded the example one again, so maybe it's not working. So now we can check the console and see what's up. Let's see. The variable objects. That's in a different one. Yes. So we're having a bug here. This is good. Bugs they happen all the time. I think this is a different script. Yeah, this isn't something we're concerned about right now. Okay. Let's read through this. That's right. I'm doing the thing again where I get too excited and I don't actually assign anything that I've written to be called in the correct spots. So our other buttons aren't actually assigned to do anything. I always jump ahead of myself on these things. I'm like, oh yes, I've written the function. Let us test it. You have to call it in order to test it. So I'm just kind of running through this quickly now. We know the deal. We add something to our on-click list. We drag over the object that contains our script, and then we use that script to call one of the public functions. So this is the previous button, so I'll say previous there. Add another one here. That. Drag this over. From the level select button, display next. Okay. So the text for sure still isn't working though, so let me look at that quickly. Button displayed level, TMP text. Should work unless I might hop into debugging mode, which might be good for you guys to know about. But first I'm just going to check that the next button's actually working. So again, if I press next on this, I should no longer, okay, yes. So now I'm loading a different level and that's good. And we can also quickly check if our if statements are working because I'm at the first one. So if I press previous, instead of breaking and just loading this level again, it should now load the last one, and it does. So that's good. We know that our forward and backward buttons and those logic checks that we wrote are working correctly. Now we just have to fix the naming issue of this button. And one other thing that might be happening here is that it is being assigned, but the text is so big that it's not even showing up. And sometimes, like, it's important to think about all the things that could possibly be wrong, because it's really easy to just be programming and look at your script and say, oh, it's something I've done isn't working, and what can I do to fix that? But sometimes it's not that it's not working, it's just not displaying as you would expect. That can be an issue sometimes. So I'm going to make this a lot tinier, maybe like 6 even, because these are really long level names. And see if maybe that displays now. Okay, still nothing, so I don't think it's that. And it doesn't look like we're getting errors in our actual script that we're working in. So I'm going to attach a debugger. You guys don't really have to worry about this, but it might be helpful for you guys to know how it works, or be interesting at least. So you can attach, when you're running things in Visual Studio, in your own code, in your own engine or something like that, you can place these stops called breakpoints, which basically let you check exactly what's going on at every step of the programming process. And it's really helpful for being able to see line by line switches in code. So I'm going to put a breakpoint there. Do this again. And this is being called. So right now our text is button. That's what we would expect. And now don't worry about the buttons that I'm pressing, but I'm going to press a button to step over it and see what it is now. So now it's null. Interesting. So that means that something with this line of code is not correct. And that's, so get seen by build index. Interesting. It might just not be, this function just might not work exactly how I would expect it to by name. That does happen. You know, I assume that it's getting the scene by build index and that I'm able to access the scene, but it might be the case that unless I store the scene or actually load the scene, I might not be able to actually access all of the variables involved with it. So I will say that I will leave that problem for another time. And regardless, I think that we've done some good work today and covered a few of the basic concepts of programming in Unity, some coding concepts just that generally apply, like variables and functions and if statements, and some that are more specific to Unity, like getting components and children and hooking things up between the scene and the actual script. And hopefully this was a pretty good starting overview. I know that UI isn't as enthralling as making a game mechanic, but it does give you some really good core skills. So thank you guys for joining us. Hopefully on the next stream we will figure out a better way even than my initial plan of how to display the level names. But thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time for Feisty Ferrets. Bye.